My name is Natalie Brooks, and the first sign that something in my family had gone dangerously wrong wasn't a fight, it was a canceled airline ticket. Within the same week, my father was admitted to a hospital for a heart condition. His medication began disappearing from a locked hotel room. Police were called to a family vacation in Arizona, and a legal process was set in motion that no one believed would ever involve us. By the time a judge became part of our lives, the damage had already been done. This isn't a story about one bad decision. It's about years of quiet permission granted in the name of grief, love, and protection, until a child learned she could push further each time and never be stopped. Until another learned that silence was safer than truth. What you're about to hear involves medical risk, legal consequences, and a family forced to choose between facing reality or continuing a lie that was putting someone's life in danger. I didn't plan to tell this story. But once everything collapsed, there was no way to stay quiet anymore. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and knowing you're here matters. If stories about family survival and hard truths resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Subscribing is a quiet way of saying you're listening. For a long time, I told myself that what happened inside our house didn't qualify as abuse. There were no bruises to hide, no screaming matches that spilled out into the street, no single moment dramatic enough for an outsider to step in and say something was wrong. Everything that happened stayed small, contained, easy to explain away. That was the problem. I was 15 when my grandmother gave me her antique watch. It wasn't valuable in any way that could be measured, but it was the last thing she owned before her memory began to slip. She pressed it into my palm with fingers that shook more than she wanted them to, and told me to take care of it. I wrapped it carefully in a soft cloth and kept it in the top drawer of my dresser, opening it sometimes, just to make sure it was still there. A week later, the drawer was empty. I searched my room twice before I asked anyone. When I finally did, Avery said she'd only borrowed it. She said it casually, like she was talking about a sweater or a book. I found the watch days later in her desk drawer, uncovered the glass face, scratched the clasp bent, just enough that it no longer closed properly. When I showed it to my parents, they exchanged a look that told me the conversation was already over. They said she hadn't meant to damage it, that I shouldn't be so attached to things. That phrase she didn't mean to settled into our house like furniture no one planned to move. That same night, I lay down in bed and felt something shift under my pillow. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then, I turned on the lamp and saw insects crawling along the seam of the fabric. I remember sitting up too fast, my heart racing, my skin crawling in a way that didn't stop even after I'd shaken the pillow onto the floor. Avery stood in the doorway. She didn't look surprised. She didn't apologize or explain. She just watched me, head tilted slightly, and asked if I was scared. The question wasn't curious. It felt measured, like she was checking the result of an experiment. I told myself it was childish behavior, that kids did strange things, that she was younger and younger meant impulsive. I told myself it didn't matter. In high school, I had my first real date. His name was Ethan. We met at a cafe a few blocks from school, the kind of place that smelled like burned coffee and disinfectant. I spent too long choosing what to wear, wanting to look like someone easy, someone uncomplicated, someone who didn't carry the weight of her family into every room. Avery showed up halfway through. She spilled her drink on my shirt and laughed, already apologizing before anyone could react. Then she stayed. She sat down and started talking. She shared things about me I'd never told anyone else, small personal details I'd trusted her with, because I thought that's what sisters did. I watched Ethan's expression change, the way people look when they realize they've stepped into something they don't understand. He left early, apologizing in a way that felt rehearsed. On the walk home, Avery leaned in close and told me he deserved someone less complicated. When I brought it up to my parents, they said she was just being honest, that I should learn to laugh at myself, that I was too sensitive. That became the explanation for everything. If I was hurt, it was because I reacted wrong. If something felt off, it was because I misunderstood. Over time, I stopped asking questions out loud. I started keeping track silently instead. I learned which incidents would be dismissed and which ones weren't worth mentioning at all. The pattern became clear before I had words for it. Avery's intent mattered more than the impact, and her intent was always assumed to be harmless. Mine was always suspect. The house stayed calm as long as I absorbed whatever happened without reacting. When I stayed quiet, there were no lectures, no sighs of disappointment, no reminders about how much everyone had already been through. Silence became a kind of currency. I spent it to keep the peace. I didn't understand then what that silence was teaching her, or what it was taking from me. I only knew that every small incident slid neatly into place, never addressed, never resolved. They stacked up quietly like proof no one was collecting. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. This wasn't cruelty in the way people expect it to look. It was permission. Permission granted again and again, each time something went unexplained, each time the harm was minimized, each time I was told to let it go. And permission, once learned, doesn't disappear on its own. By the time I understood what favoritism really was, it had already stopped being something anyone questioned. It wasn't a behavior anymore. It was a rule, quiet, flexible, and enforced without being spoken. Whenever I tried to explain what was happening, my parents responded the same way. They didn't deny the events themselves. They denied the meaning. She didn't mean it. You're reading too much into things. You know how sensitive she is. Each sentence gently shifted the weight of the problem back onto me until I began to doubt my own reactions more than her actions. Over time, I became the source of tension simply by noticing patterns. If I raised my voice even slightly, I was told I was escalating. If I stayed calm, I was told I was being passive-aggressive. There was no version of concern that didn't somehow become my fault. Avery, on the other hand, was treated like a variable the rest of us were expected to adjust around. Her moods were accommodated, her behavior contextualized, her mistakes reframed as misunderstandings. I learned to watch my words carefully, to anticipate how conversations would land before I spoke. I learned that timing mattered more than truth, and that truth itself was negotiable depending on who delivered it. When I graduated high school, leaving didn't feel dramatic. It felt necessary. I accepted a job offer in Seattle working for a technology company that promised long hours and clear expectations. I rented a small apartment and built a life that didn't require explanation. For the first time, my days followed rules that applied equally to everyone. If I did my work, I was left alone. If I didn't, there were consequences. It was simple, honest. The distance helped, but it didn't erase anything. Every time I came home, I was reminded of how little space I occupied there. My things were never where I left them. Clothes went missing. Electronics malfunctioned. Important documents ended up in the wrong drawers. Avery treated me like a guest she hadn't invited, polite enough to outsiders, distant when we were alone. She spoke to me carefully, as if we were strangers with shared history rather than sisters. When I mentioned it, my parents told me not to be territorial, that it was still Avery's home, that I should be grateful she was willing to share. I started shortening my visits. I stopped staying overnight. I learned to leave before anything could go wrong, before the small disruptions piled up into something that left me exhausted for days afterward. Family gatherings became something I managed rather than enjoyed. I positioned myself near exits. I kept conversations light. I avoided topics that might trigger Avery's attention. When relatives asked why I lived so far away, my parents said I'd always been independent, that I liked my space. They weren't wrong. They just weren't honest about why. What I didn't realize at the time was how much this arrangement depended on me continuing to absorb the imbalance. As long as I stayed distant, calm, and agreeable, the family system held. Avery had no reason to escalate. My parents had no reason to confront anything. The structure worked until it didn't. The first cracks appeared not in arguments but in expectation. My parents began assuming I would accommodate without being asked, that I would adjust my schedule, that I would understand, that I would forgive. I was reliable in ways Avery wasn't, and reliability slowly became obligation. When I declined invitations or questioned plans, the disappointment in their voices felt heavier than any accusation. I began to realize that my absence wasn't neutral. It disrupted a balance they relied on, one where I absorbed discomfort quietly so others didn't have to. Looking back, I see how carefully the lines were drawn. Avery was protected from consequences. I was protected from confrontation by being excluded from it entirely. Neither of us was ever asked what we needed. The difference was that I learned to survive without asking. I told myself I was fine with the distance, that I'd chosen it, that independence was a strength. And for a while that felt true. But favoritism doesn't stay contained. It grows. It adapts. It waits for moments of vulnerability, illness, fear, uncertainty, and then it tests how far it can go. I didn't know then that the next time my family asked me to come home, it wouldn't be optional in the way visits used to be. It would arrive wrapped in concern and urgency, a medical emergency, a request that sounded like reconciliation. And I would say yes, believing against my better judgment that something serious might finally change how we saw each other. The call came on a Tuesday morning right as I was settling into my desk at work. My mother's voice sounded thinner than usual, stretched tight in a way that made me sit up straighter before she even said what was wrong. My father had suffered a heart attack. It wasn't the kind people collapse from in movies. No dramatic fall. No ambulance lights outside the house. It was described to me in careful, minimizing language, moderate, manageable, caught in time. Still, he'd been admitted to the hospital, kept overnight monitored. A stent was placed to open a blocked artery. The doctor stressed the importance of routine medication and reduced stress. My mother repeated those words to me like she was memorizing them, afraid they'd disappear if she didn't. I flew home that weekend. Seeing my father in a hospital bed unsettled me more than I expected. He looked smaller somehow, his skin paler against the white sheets. Tubes ran where strength used to be. He joked weakly about the food, tried to wave off concern, but his hand shook when he lifted the cup of water. I noticed it even when no one else seemed to. Avery stayed close to him, hovering in a way that looked like devotion from a distance. She spoke softly, adjusted his pillow, reminded nurses about his preferences. My parents watched her with something like relief, as if her attentiveness proved they'd done something right. The doctor was clear before discharge. My father needed consistency, medication taken on schedule, no missed doses, no unnecessary stress. My mother nodded, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles went white. A few days later, my father suggested a short trip. Sedona, Arizona. Just a few days, he said. A change of scenery. Time together. He framed it as recovery, as something the doctor would approve of, even though no doctor had actually suggested it. He said he wanted to feel normal again, wanted us all in the same place for once. I hesitated. Travel after a heart attack didn't sound like rest to me. Neither did group trips. But my parents sounded hopeful in a way I hadn't heard in years. Like this was a reset. Like if we could just get away from the house, from routines and habits, something might realign. I asked about Avery. There was a pause. Then my mother said, of course Avery would come. She said it gently, as if cushioning the answer. I told myself that wasn't a reason to say no, that if I wanted things to change, I couldn't keep opting out. I requested time off work. I rearranged meetings. I packed carefully, double-checking flight details, hotel confirmations, everything that could go wrong. Part of me needed control. Another part wanted to believe control wouldn't be necessary. Avery didn't hide her displeasure when she learned I was coming. She didn't confront me directly. She never did. Instead, she sighed loudly when plans were discussed. She questioned the timing. She asked why the trip needed to include everyone. She spoke to my parents in a tone that sounded concerned, reasonable, even caring, while casting brief glances at me that made it clear who she thought was complicating things. I noticed the shift immediately. My parents began justifying the trip to her instead of to me, explaining details, asking if she was comfortable, making adjustments around her preferences. The old pattern slid back into place so smoothly it almost felt intentional. Still, I held on to hope. Medical crises have a way of rearranging priorities. I'd seen it happen in other families. Illness forced honesty. Fear stripped away pretense. I believed naively, it turns out, that nearly losing my father might finally interrupt whatever dynamic had been running unchecked in our house for so long. The night before our flight, I lay awake in my apartment listening to the city outside my window. I thought about my father's hand shaking around the hospital cup, about the way my mother's voice cracked when she said his name, about how quickly things could change. I didn't consider the possibility that the trip itself would become a test, not of closeness, not of healing, but of how much exclusion I was still expected to accept without protest. At the airport the next morning, I watched my parents move ahead of me in line Avery, between them animated and alert. I told myself I was imagining the distance, that once we were on the plane, it wouldn't matter where anyone stood. I didn't know then that the most important moment of that trip would happen before any of us ever left the ground. Airports have a way of flattening people. Everyone moves with the same tired focus, the same muted urgency. I remember thinking that morning felt unusually calm, too calm in retrospect. We arrived at SeaTac early. My parents checked a single suitcase between them. Avery carried a small backpack slung casually over one shoulder. I stood a few steps behind, scrolling through my phone, confirming the boarding time I already knew by heart. Everything looked right. The flight number, the gate, the departure time. I'd checked it twice the night before, once again that morning, the habit of someone who learned early that mistakes, real or imagined, were often blamed on her. When the boarding announcement came, we joined the line. That was when the agent paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard longer than they should have. She frowned slightly, then asked for my ID again. I handed it over without thinking much of it. These things happened. Glitches. System errors. I waited for her to correct it. Instead, she looked at me with practiced neutrality and said my ticket had been canceled. The word landed oddly. Not loud, not sharp. Just final. I laughed at first, assuming it was a mistake. I told her I'd checked in online, that I was traveling with my family. She turned the screen toward me. The reservation was gone. Not delayed. Not flagged. Cancelled. I felt heat rise to my face as the line behind us grew impatient. I stepped aside to clear space, my parents and Avery drifting with me without quite stopping. My mother asked what was wrong, her tone already defensive, as if bracing for inconvenience rather than concern. I checked my email. There it was. A cancellation notice time-stamped less than an hour earlier. No explanation. No request for confirmation. Just a quiet, administrative fact. I looked up and met Avery's eyes. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look guilty either. She smiled, not broadly, not openly, just enough to register. Then she looked away. I asked my parents to wait. Just a few minutes. I told them it had to be a mistake, that I'd fix it. My father sighed, rubbing his chest absently, already tired. My mother glanced at her watch. They both looked at the gate, at the growing line of passengers, at the clock, ticking toward boarding closure. The agent explained that reinstating the ticket would take time. There were no remaining seats on that flight. The next available option was hours later, maybe the following day. My mother said that was unfortunate. She said it softly, as if lowering her voice made the situation gentler. I pulled up the account activity on my phone, my hands shaking now. There it was. A login from our home computer. The same browser my parents used. The same IP address. The reservation accessed. Modified. Cancelled. I showed it to my mother. She barely looked. She said I was overreacting, that these systems weren't always accurate, that I shouldn't jump to conclusions. My father shifted his weight discomfort written plainly across his face. He said airlines made mistakes all the time. That stress wasn't good for his heart, that we could talk about it later. Later. The boarding call changed. Final boarding. I asked them not to go, just to wait, to help me sort it out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I just asked. My mother hesitated for half a second. Then she touched my arm and told me we'd talk when they got back. That I should book another flight. That everything didn't need to be a crisis. My father nodded already, turning toward the gate. Avery didn't say a word. I stood there as they handed over their boarding passes as they walked down the jet bridge without looking back. I watched until they disappeared from sight, the space they left behind suddenly too wide. Around me, the airport noise rushed back in. Rolling suitcases. Announcements echoing overhead. Someone laughing nearby. Life continuing at the same pace it always had. I stood alone at the gate, my phone still open in my hand, proof glowing uselessly on the screen. That was the moment something shifted. Not because I was surprised I wasn't. Not really. But because it was the first time the exclusion was undeniable. Public. Witnessed. No story could soften it. No later explanation could change what had already happened. I didn't cry. I didn't chase after them. I sat down in an empty row of chairs and stared at the departure board until the flight number disappeared. For the first time, I understood that whatever held my family together didn't include me. And that realization, once formed, couldn't be undone. 3 days passed before my phone rang. I'd spent the first night after the airport sitting on my couch, still dressed, replaying the moment over and over until it lost its edges. By the second day, I'd returned to work out of necessity more than focus. I answered emails. I joined meetings. I spoke when spoken to. Everything felt slightly out of sync, like I was moving a fraction of a second behind myself. When my mother's name appeared on my screen, I answered immediately. She didn't ease into it. Her voice was tight, breathless. She said something was wrong with my father. Not another heart attack, at least not yet, but his medication kept going missing. Pills that were supposed to be taken at the same time every day were disappearing from the hotel room. She said she'd checked the bathroom, the bedside table, the travel bag. She said she was scared. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter, grounding myself before I spoke. I asked her to slow down. I asked when he'd last taken his dose. I asked if he was feeling dizzy, short of breath, confused. She answered each question in fragments, her fear leaking through the gaps. Then she said she'd found the medication. All of it. Stuffed into Avery's handbag. There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches longer than it should. My mother sounded stunned, as if the discovery hadn't fully registered yet. She kept saying she didn't understand. That Avery must have moved it by mistake. That there had to be a reasonable explanation. I didn't argue. I didn't validate the excuse either. I told her not to confront Avery. Not yet. I told her to focus on my father, to get him checked immediately. Missing heart medication even briefly wasn't something to wait out. An hour later, my mother called back. My father had been admitted to a local hospital. His heart rhythm was unstable. Not catastrophic, the doctors said, but serious enough to warrant observation. They asked questions about his medication schedule. My mother answered carefully, omitting details she wasn't ready to face. I stayed on the phone until visiting hours ended. That night, I lay awake thinking about the handbag, about how deliberate it felt, about the timing, about the way Avery had smiled at the airport. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't careless. It was controlled. She wasn't just manipulating situations anymore. She was testing consequences. The next morning, my mother called again, her voice lower this time, as if she were afraid of being overheard. She said she'd asked Avery why the pills were in her bag. Avery had shrugged. She said she'd been worried my father was taking too much. She said she'd wanted to manage it. When my mother pressed further, Avery accused her of overreacting, of not trusting her. I recognized the language immediately, the reframing, the shift from concern to accusation. By the third day, my father was discharged with strict instructions. No missed doses, no stress. My parents were exhausted, worn down. They tried to resume the trip as planned, telling themselves the scare was over. It wasn't. That evening, Avery's behavior escalated. My mother described it later in a voice that barely sounded like her own. Screaming. Objects thrown across the hotel room. Accusations hurled indiscriminately. Avery said they were ungrateful, that she'd sacrificed everything for them, that no one appreciated how much pressure she was under. She said she'd done it to prove a point. Hotel security was called. Then the police. I learned about it in pieces through fragmented phone calls and messages that grew more frantic as the night wore on. Avery refused to cooperate. She shouted at officers. She resisted when they tried to calm her down. Eventually, they detained her. My parents didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how things had reached this point. After Avery was released, something else went missing. Their passports, their wallets, cash, credit cards. My parents were stranded in Arizona, unable to return home. Their documents gone, their nerves shot. They sat in a hotel room that no longer felt safe, realizing for the first time that the person they'd built their lives around might actually be dangerous. They called me because they had no other option. They asked for help, financial, logistical, emotional, in the same breath. My mother cried openly now. My father sounded ashamed. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known who else to call. I listened. I asked questions. I booked flights. I wired money. I coordinated replacements for documents. I did everything they asked without comment. Not because I felt vindicated, but because even then I understood something they didn't yet. They had spent years protecting Avery from consequences, and in doing so, they had left themselves and me unprotected. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted, not because I demanded it, but because reality finally refused to cooperate with denial. And there was no going back to how things had been. When my parents finally made it back home, the house felt different before anyone said a word. The air was heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what happened in Arizona and were waiting to see if it would be acknowledged. I arrived the same evening they did, having driven up after work, unsure of what I would walk into, but certain it wouldn't resemble anything we'd known before. Avery was already there. She sat on the couch when I entered, legs tucked beneath her, phone in hand, scrolling as if nothing had happened. No apology, no embarrassment, no visible concern for the fact that our father had been hospitalized days earlier because his medication had disappeared. She looked up at me briefly, her expression neutral, then returned to her screen. My parents stood in the kitchen, speaking in low voices. They looked older than they had a week ago. Not physically, though exhaustion had carved new lines into their faces, but in the way people do when something fundamental has cracked. My mother's hands trembled as she poured water. My father sat down heavily at the table, pressing his palm against his chest, not in pain, but in habit. That night, they told Avery she needed to move out. The words were careful, almost apologetic. They framed it as temporary, a cooling-off period, space for everyone. They said it wasn't punishment. They said they loved her. They said they just needed things to calm down. Avery listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When they finished, she smiled. It wasn't the smile she used in public. This one was smaller, tighter. She asked if they were serious. When my mother nodded, Avery's posture shifted. Her voice rose not immediately but steadily like a pressure gauge climbing. She said they were abandoning her. She said they were choosing me. She said after everything she'd done for them, this was how they repaid her. She accused them of emotional abuse, of manipulation, of turning on their own child. The language was sharp, rehearsed, and unsettlingly precise. When my father tried to speak, Avery cut him off. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. She moved through the house, opening drawers, slamming doors, her agitation escalating with every step. She threatened to call the police herself. She threatened to tell people things. She said she had proof of how badly she'd been treated. No one raised their voice to match hers. The next days blurred together. Avery didn't leave. Instead, she made the house unlivable. She hid car keys, she unplugged appliances, she played music late into the night loud enough to keep my parents awake, then denied doing it when confronted. She rearranged items, moved documents, disrupted routines in ways that felt intentional and precise. The goal wasn't chaos, it was pressure. My parents stopped sleeping. My father's health became a constant concern again, his medication now locked away, monitored, handled carefully. My mother jumped at every sound. They tried reasoning, then pleading, then silence. None of it worked. I watched all of this from a distance that felt both necessary and unbearable. I didn't intervene unless asked. I didn't confront Avery directly. I recognized the pattern too well. Engagement only fed it. Still, there were moments when I had to leave the room, my chest tight, my hands shaking, the familiar urge to disappear, resurfacing. One night, it crossed a line no one could minimize. It started as another argument, voices raised, accusations exchanged, but it escalated quickly. Avery moved into the kitchen where my father stood, her movements abrupt, her words slurred with emotion. She grabbed a knife from the counter, not hesitating, not dramatic, just fast. I remember the sound my mother made, a sharp intake of breath that turned into a scream. Avery lunged forward. My father stumbled back, knocking into the counter. My mother dialed 911 with shaking fingers, shouting for help, while trying to position herself between them. The knife clattered to the floor as Avery continued yelling, incoherent now uncontained. The police arrived within minutes. They separated everyone, asked questions, assessed the scene. Avery was handcuffed without resistance this time, her earlier fury draining into something hollow and volatile. She accused my parents again as they let her out. She said they'd forced her to this. She said she'd make them regret it. The house was silent after the door closed behind her. In the days that followed, my parents did something they'd never done before. They hired a lawyer, not to protect Avery, to protect themselves, to understand their options, to establish boundaries that weren't negotiable. The legal process moved forward slowly, deliberately. Documentation was gathered, statements were written, incidents were recorded. The language was clinical, precise, stripped of emotion in a way that made everything feel more real. A court order was issued. Avery was required to leave the house. There was no celebration, no relief dramatic enough to name, just a quiet exhaustion settling into the spaces where fear had lived for too long. My parents looked at each other differently now, not with blame, but with recognition. They had waited too long to intervene, and the cost of that delay had nearly been irreversible. As I drove back to Seattle after everything was finalized, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Some relationships don't end because love disappears. They end because denial finally does. The days after Avery was ordered to leave didn't bring the relief I expected. There was no sudden calm, no sense of safety returning, just because a judge's signature said it should. Instead, the house settled into something quieter and more unsettling, an aftershock period, where everyone waited for the next impact. Avery didn't come back, but she didn't disappear either. She called repeatedly at first. Then she started leaving messages. Some were tearful, almost childlike. Others were sharp, threatening, filled with accusations that twisted events into shapes I barely recognized. She said my parents had destroyed her life. She said I'd turned them against her. She said she had records proof people who would listen. Each message ended the same way, by demanding something: money, access, apologies. My parents didn't answer. That decision alone seemed to take more strength than anything else they'd done. I watched them struggle with it in small ways, my mother hovering over her phone, starting to dial before stopping herself. My father staring at the floor, jaw clenched, as if waiting for the ground to give way beneath him. They were grieving, but not in the way people expect. This wasn't the loss of a child. It was the loss of an idea that if you loved someone hard enough, long enough, you could keep them from becoming dangerous. The lawyer advised strict boundaries: no contact, documentation of every attempt. Locks changed, security measures installed. The words sounded excessive when spoken aloud. They sounded like something that happened to other families, not ours. Still, my parents followed the advice. The house became a controlled space. Medication was stored in locked containers. Important documents were moved off-site. Routines were simplified. There was a schedule posted on the refrigerator, not as a reminder, but as reassurance. Predictability became its own kind of safety. I stayed for several days, sleeping in the guest room, listening to the house at night. Every sound felt amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the click of the thermostat, the wind moving through trees outside. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to break the quiet. Nothing did. Instead, what surfaced was guilt. My parents talked more during that week than they had in years, not in long conversations, but in fragments. Admissions slipped out unexpectedly, like truths that had waited too long for permission. My mother said she'd always known something was off, but she was afraid of what acknowledging it would mean. My father admitted he'd confused protection with avoidance. He said he thought minimizing problems kept the peace. Neither of them asked me to absolve them. That mattered. They didn't rush forgiveness. They didn't ask me to reassure them that they'd done their best. They just spoke quietly, sometimes painfully, as if naming things was the only way to keep them from happening again. Avery's mental health came up eventually, carefully. They didn't use it as an excuse. They didn't dismiss it either. They acknowledged that something was wrong, that it likely had been for a long time, and that ignoring it hadn't helped anyone. They talked about treatment options, about what responsibility looked like when someone was both struggling and causing harm. I listened without interrupting. There was no neat resolution to any of it. No clear answers. Just an understanding that complexity didn't erase accountability. When I returned to Seattle, the distance felt different this time. Not like escape, like choice. My parents visited a month later. They stayed in a small hotel nearby rather than in my apartment, respecting the space without making a show of it. We met for meals. We walked through neighborhoods I'd made my own. They asked about my work, my routines, the life I'd built away from them. For once, the curiosity felt genuine rather than obligatory. They apologized directly without qualification. Not just for the airport, not just for Arizona, but for the years of dismissal, the times they'd asked me to be quiet so things would stay manageable. They acknowledged the cost of that silence. They didn't ask me to move past it. They just named it. I didn't promise forgiveness. I told them I was willing to keep talking, to rebuild something slowly without pretending the past hadn't happened. They accepted that answer without pushing for more. That was new. I still think about Avery, about where she is, whether she's safe, whether she's getting help. Concern hasn't vanished just because contact has stopped, but concern no longer overrides reality. It no longer demands sacrifice. Families like to believe love can compensate for anything. That intention matters more than outcome. That acknowledging harm somehow creates it. What I learned is simpler and harder than that. Ignoring patterns doesn't keep them from growing. Silence doesn't make danger disappear. And love without boundaries isn't love, it's permission. The court date arrived quietly. No spectacle, no crowd. Just a time, a room number, and paperwork that reduced years of family history into orderly paragraphs and checkboxes. I didn't attend in person. My parents asked if I wanted to, and I told them I wasn't ready. That was the truth. I followed everything from Seattle through calls with the lawyer and careful summaries emailed late at night. I read the document, slowly absorbing the language that stripped emotion from events I could still feel in my body. The order was clear. Avery was not permitted to return to the house. Any contact had to go through legal channels. Violations would carry consequences. The phrasing was firm, unemotional, and final, in a way my family had never been. My parents didn't celebrate. They sat at the kitchen table afterward, the same one where so many explanations had been offered over the years, and stared at the wood grain as if trying to memorize it. My mother said she felt like she was betraying her child. My father said he felt like he'd already done that, just in the opposite direction. They signed what needed signing. In the weeks that followed, Avery tested the boundary exactly the way you'd expect someone to. She sent messages through third parties. She showed up at places she knew my parents frequented. She left notes that sounded conciliatory until you read them closely. The lawyer advised consistency. No response. No engagement. Every incident documented. Each time my parents followed the advice, it got a little easier. Not because the fear disappeared, but because the rules were no longer flexible. For the first time, the line didn't move to accommodate her reaction. I returned home once during that period, not because I was needed, but because I wanted to see the house for myself. The changes were subtle. New locks, a security system, a binder on the counter labeled with dates and incident numbers. Evidence of a life adjusted around prevention rather than hope. My father showed me where he kept his medication, now locked, logged, routine bound. He joked about it lightly, but his eyes were serious. He knew how close he'd come to something worse. So did my mother. She watched him take each dose, not out of control, but out of care, sharpened by reality. One evening, as we sat together without distraction, my mother asked me a question she'd never asked before. "When did you realize something was wrong?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about the watch, the pillow, the cafe, the airport, the hotel hallway, the knife. "I think I always knew," I said finally. "I just didn't know what it meant." She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. She said she wished she'd asked me that years ago. I believed her. The hardest part wasn't accepting that Avery had to leave. It was accepting that love hadn't failed because it was insufficient, but because it had been misdirected. My parents had spent so long protecting one child from consequences that they'd put everyone else at risk, including themselves. Naming that didn't erase the grief. It gave it shape. I drove back to Seattle the next morning, the road stretching out in front of me like something neutral and honest. Distance no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like alignment. I was returning to a life that didn't require me to disappear in order to function. Weeks later, my parents visited again. This time, there was less heaviness in the air. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being denied. We talked about ordinary things, work, weather, the cost of groceries, without tension creeping in from the edges. When difficult topics arose, they were addressed directly, then set aside without pretending they'd vanished. At the end of the visit, my father said something that stayed with me. "I don't know if we can fix what we missed," he said. "But I know we can stop pretending it didn't matter." That felt like the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from him. I still don't know what Avery's future looks like. I don't know if she'll seek help or continue to blame everyone around her. I don't know if she'll ever understand the line she crossed or why it couldn't be erased by apology or explanation. What I do know is this: some moments create a before and an after, whether you're ready for them or not. The courtroom didn't end our family. It revealed it. And once something is revealed, it can't be unseen. Time didn't heal anything on its own. It just created space enough distance for patterns to become visible without the constant pressure of reacting to them. In that space, my parents and I began something quieter and more difficult than reconciliation. We began learning how to exist without denial. They came to Seattle in early spring not because of a crisis, not because they needed something fixed. They asked first. They waited for my answer. When they arrived, they stayed nearby, respecting boundaries without making them feel like punishment. It was the first time I noticed how much effort that kind of respect actually takes. We spent our days walking through the city, stopping for coffee, sitting in parks where no one knew our history. The conversations were unforced, sometimes light, sometimes heavy. When difficult memories surfaced, no one rushed to smooth them over. My parents listened without interrupting, without reframing, without trying to correct my experience. That was new. At one point, my mother admitted something she'd never said out loud before. She said she'd mistaken endurance for strength, that she'd praised me for being easy because it made the household manageable. She said she hadn't realized how much that praise cost me. My father followed with his own admission. He said he'd believed love meant absorbing damage quietly, that protecting one child required sacrificing conflict with another. He said he'd confused calm with health. Neither of them asked for forgiveness. They didn't try to justify the years of dismissal. They didn't point to Avery's struggles as explanation or excuse. They acknowledged them as part of the picture, not the frame. They talked about the guilt they carried now, about the fear that they'd waited too long to act, about how close they'd come to losing everything because they were afraid to confront one thing. I told them I wasn't ready to forgive, that the trust I'd lost couldn't be restored through intention alone. They accepted that without defensiveness. They said they understood that rebuilding something required patience they hadn't earned yet. We agreed to keep talking, slowly, with honesty, without pressure to reach a conclusion. Avery was mentioned, but carefully. My parents told me she was receiving evaluations, that professionals were involved. They didn't present it as redemption or resolution, just information. They didn't ask me to resume contact. They didn't suggest that understanding meant re-entry. That mattered more than they knew. I still think about my sister, about the version of her I defended as a child, about the moments where intervention might have changed the trajectory. That grief exists alongside the relief of distance. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out. What I've learned is that accountability and compassion aren't opposites. You can recognize pain without surrendering to it. You can care without sacrificing safety. You can love someone and still refuse to be harmed by them. Family isn't defined by proximity or permanence. It's defined by what's allowed to exist without being erased. For years, my role had been to disappear so others could remain comfortable. Stepping out of that role felt selfish at first. Then it felt necessary. Now it feels like survival in its most honest form. I don't know what the future holds for any of us. There are no guarantees that patterns won't try to reassert themselves, that fear won't tempt retreat into old habits. What's different now is awareness. And awareness once gained changes the cost of denial. My parents and I aren't healed, but we are awake. And for the first time, that feels like enough to begin. There's a belief we're taught early on that family is something you endure, not something you evaluate. That love means staying, forgiving, absorbing. That if you're patient enough, quiet enough, everything will eventually even out. What I learned is different. Silence doesn't create peace. It just delays the moment when reality demands to be addressed. And by the time it does, the cost is often higher than anyone expected. Patterns don't disappear because we refuse to name them. They become more efficient, more dangerous, more normalized. I also learned that accountability doesn't erase love, it clarifies it. Protecting someone from consequences doesn't protect them. It teaches them where the limits are and how far they can push before something breaks. Real care requires boundaries even when they're uncomfortable. Especially then. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring about others. It means you stop disappearing to make caring possible. If this story resonated with you, if parts of it felt uncomfortably familiar, I'd really like to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there, right now? Your experiences matter here more than you might think, and if you found value in spending this time with me, thank you. Liking the video or subscribing helps this space continue, and I'm genuinely grateful if you choose to do that.